And I'm aware that you obviously can't get into details. Can you give any kind of ballpark about how many other countries we're talking about here? Is it a lot of other countries that engage in foreign interference in Canada?
No, we're not allowed. I'm sorry, I can't speculate or get into that. Thank you. Thank you for trying. Let me now turn to the second review in the 2019 annual report, the government response to foreign interference. This review examined the threat facing Canada from foreign interference and the government's response to that threat. On both fronts, the committee heard testimony from dozens of officials from the Canadian security and intelligence community, reviewed thousands of pages of documentation, both classified and open source, and I mean thousands of pages, and deliberated at great length. First, the threat. Our democratic institutions and independent media, civil society, academia, and our electoral system and process support effective, accountable, and transparent government. However, the review demonstrates that those same institutions are also vulnerable to foreign actors seeking to covertly and inappropriately interfere or exert influence in Canada. To repeat, the committee sought to present a clear description of the magnitude and nature of the challenge of foreign interference in Canada. The committee's assessment of the threat is best described at paragraph 189 on page 77, and I quote, "The committee believes there is ample evidence that Canada is the target of significant and sustained foreign interference activities. The PRC, the Russian Federation, other states." The committee believes that these states target Canada for a variety of reasons, but all seek to exploit the openness of our society and penetrate our fundamental institutions to meet their objectives. They target ethno-cultural communities, seek to corrupt the political process, manipulate the media, and attempt to curate debate on post-secondary campuses. Each of these activities pose a significant risk to the rights and freedoms of Canadians and to the country's sovereignty. They are a clear threat to the security of Canada. The committee conducted a thorough examination of the primary security and intelligence organizations responsible for investigating and countering the threat of foreign interference: CSIS, Global Affairs Canada, the Privy Council Office, Public Safety Canada, and the RCMP. We undertook a deep dive into the extent and sufficiency of interdepartmental coordination. We examined a series of case studies of Canadian responses to instances of foreign interference in Canada. We examined the extent to which the Government of Canada engaged with other orders of government and the Canadian public. And finally, we examined international collaboration and coordination. The review found that the interdepartmental coordination and collaboration on foreign interference was done on a case-by-case, even on an ad hoc basis. It found also that there are differences in how individual organizations interpret the gravity and prevalence of the threat. And it found the federal government's engagement with provincial and municipal governments and the Canadian public on the threat from foreign interference has been limited.
Most afternoon. Thanks for taking our questions. In terms of foreign interference and the recommendations, you talk about a whole-of-government approach, but obviously espionage is about as old as statecraft itself. So what's missing? What are the gaps right now that need to be addressed in the government's response to this sustained effort by numerous countries, including China and Russia, to spy on Canadians?
The report goes to considerable length foreign interference under two key rubrics. One is a clear description of the threat, and the other is, perhaps most importantly, the government's response to that threat. But let's be clear on this. There is ample evidence the committee believes that Canada is the target of significant and sustained foreign interference activities. The committee also believes that these activities pose a significant risk to the rights and the freedoms of Canadians and to our sovereignty. They are a clear threat to the security of Canada. One of the things we do point to in the report is the example from Australia. Just recently, Australia launched its new counter-interference strategy. It also then created the post of the National Counter-Foreign Interference Coordinator, and then as recently as December 2019, backstopped it with a recently created task force to deal specifically with foreign interference in Australia, and funded it to the tune of $90 million for a single task force.
But specifically within the framework here, I mean, is there a lack of communication between, it seems that CSIS takes the lead on most of these files. Is there a lack of communication when it comes to the RCMP? And it seems that the CBSA, I know that they're covered in a different section of this report, but it does seem like there's a need for the CBSA to also have be more in the loop when it comes to the potential of foreign interference and within Canada's governance structures and institutions.
You're right in pointing out that there needs to be enhanced cooperation, interdepartmental cooperation, integration, sharing of information, clarity when it comes to defining what foreign interference is or is not. Better efforts at reaching out and engaging civil society actors, academic institutions, the Canadian public. All of these things are laid out in considerable detail in the review itself, which is why we're saying it's time for Canada to move forward and improve its cooperation at the governmental level.
Given what we've seen south of the border in the 2016 election, I don't think many Canadians would necessarily be surprised by the fact that there are foreign actors, Russia and China as an example, that would be trying to interfere with our democracy. So is it fair to say that with this report today, you're sending a message to the government that they've not been taking this seriously enough?
I think what we're saying to the government is that it's a reminder from the committee that Canada is the target of significant and sustained foreign interference activities. We're saying that there have been efforts made at the governmental level, different institutions, departments, agencies, to respond to it, but that response can be vastly improved. We're saying that there's no evidence that foreign interference is going to cease and desist. We're saying that it appears to be continuous. It appears to be in different settings. It appears to be, we've listed a number of examples in university contexts. We've talked about this at length when it comes to media and the free media, foreign language media. We've talked about the effects of foreign interference on ethnocultural communities and the pressure some of those communities may feel. So we've pointed this out, we've broken it down into, as I said earlier, the threat of foreign interference and the government's response to it. And we're really focusing on sending the message to the government that things can be improved. Good efforts have been made, but it's time to up our game.
So my second question, there are two countries that are named here. I understand that there are also other countries that remain unnamed. So what are those other countries and why do you not name them? Could you repeat the question? Yes, so you name two specific countries in your report that are involved in foreign interference. But you say that there are other countries involved as well, but you don't say which countries they are. So which countries are we talking about, first? And second, how would you describe the nature of the threat that they pose? But when it comes to actually naming the other countries, I can't answer that question directly.
Mr. McGinty, you mentioned in the report that you had issues with some departments and agencies in terms of the information that they were handing over, whether it was a full report or actual documents, and you've raised this with the Prime Minister. Can you name the departments or agencies that you face this resistance from?
Sure. I'm going to ask our executive director to speak to that directly, because this is very much a question of officials to officials negotiation, discussion, and of course sourcing the information. So maybe perhaps Rennie Marcoux could answer that directly for you.
Sure, thank you. So I'll just go back and quote our right of access in our legislation, because that's very important. So our act says that the committee is entitled to have access to any information that is under the control of a department and that's related to the fulfillment of the committee's mandate. Very broad access. So in the CANCIT, it would be the Department of National Defense, and also in the same national defense from in our diversity and inclusion study, and then maybe more generally from the Privy Council office itself. So,
And in follow-up,
Could I just add to that?
Sure.
I've raised this issue directly with the Prime Minister.
Right.
And we're now following up with the Prime Minister's National Security and Intelligence Advisor to make sure that we come to ground on a much clearer understanding between the committee and the government of what the committee has access to or does not have access to based on the enabling legislation. So we're following up on this quite directly.
You mentioned single out two countries, China and Russia, in terms of foreign interference. Why were you able to name those, but not the others that you mentioned are present as well?
China and Russia have been named publicly in the media, in reports by think tanks, in academic studies, by other foreign actors, partners, as states that engage in foreign interference. The committee also named China and Russia in the opening chapter of its 2018 annual report. The question of identifying or speaking about any other country is a question of redaction. And I explained the redaction process at the beginning of my comments, so we're really in no position to speak further about any other country in any detail other than China and Russia.
Given the details around how state actors are using their ethno-cultural communities, what do you want Canadians to take away from that, given there are obviously sensitivities and some of those communities already face a lot of stigma?
I would say one of the most important messages the committee wants to impart about ethno-cultural communities is that they are targets. They are targets. And that's what concerns the committee. Their rights as Canadian citizens are targeted. Their freedoms are targeted. And we've laid out the kinds of activities that take place from different sources. So we're concerned. We're concerned about our fellow Canadians.
Given the tone in the annual report and your tone now, should we take away from that China and Russia have been successful in their objectives? That these aren't just attempts?
I'm not in a position to answer that. We focused very much on what the threat looks like as fulsomely as possible, and we focused even more on the government's ability to respond to the threat, how well it was responding and where it could improve.